In 1917, the Russian Empire collapsed, swept away by war and revolution. The Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, seized power, but their new state was immediately plunged into civil war. To defend their revolution, they created the Red Army, an army of workers and peasants, not aristocrats. The Red Army's early days were desperate. One rifle for every 3 men, farm clothes for uniforms, and a belief they were fighting for their own freedom. Leon Trotsky, ruthless and brilliant, built the army from scratch, using former Tsarist officers, sometimes by force, and enforcing strict discipline. Political commissars were embedded in every unit, ensuring loyalty to the Communist Party above all else. This dual command structure, military and political, would define the Soviet military for decades. Comrade Ivan, a young recruit, recalled, "We were hungry, cold, but fighting for an idea. That's a powerful thing for a young man." The Red Army was more than a fighting force. It was a tool for social engineering. It taught millions to read, to drive, and to believe in the destiny of communism. The army became the crucible for forging the new Soviet man. It was an instrument of state power, designed to defend borders and project revolutionary ideology. The Red Army's mission was clear: to change the world, whether the world wanted it or not. The Red Army's creation marked the beginning of a new era, one where military power and ideology were inseparable. The revolution's survival depended on the army's strength and the people's belief in a new future. The Red Army would become the backbone of the Soviet state, shaping its destiny for generations. From the chaos of civil war, the Soviet military emerged as both sword and shield of the revolution. Its legacy would echo through every chapter of Soviet history. The world would soon learn just how powerful an idea and an army could be. The forging of the Red Army was just the beginning. By 1941, the Red Army was vast, but Stalin's purges had gutted its leadership. When Hitler's Wehrmacht invaded, the Soviet Union was caught off guard. Millions of soldiers were lost in weeks. The nation teetered on the brink of collapse, but it did not break. Factories were moved east, women and children took over production, and the entire country mobilized for survival. Propaganda shifted from communist ideals to raw patriotism. Yelena, a nurse at Stalingrad, remembered, "They kept coming, boys from every corner, wounded but asking, 'Are we holding them?'" The Red Army's resolve was unbreakable. They knew failure meant annihilation. The battle for Stalingrad became a symbol of Soviet defiance and a turning point in the war. By 1945, the Red Army was the world's largest ground force, raising its flag over Berlin. Victory came at a staggering cost: over 25 million Soviet dead and the Western USSR in ruins. The war transformed the Soviet Union, legitimizing Stalin's regime and establishing it as a superpower. The Red Army, hardened by the Eastern Front, now cast a long shadow over Europe. The Great Patriotic War forged the Soviet military's identity, unyielding, relentless, and central to the nation's survival. The sacrifices made would define Soviet memory and justify the regime's power for decades. The Red Army's victory was both triumph and tragedy, shaping the world order that followed. The Soviet military emerged from the war as a giant, but the scars would never fully heal. The lessons of survival and sacrifice would guide Soviet strategy in the years to come. The Red Army's legend was born in the ashes of war. The world would never forget the price of Soviet victory. The Red Army's shadow would loom over Europe for generations. The end of World War II brought a new conflict, the Cold War. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki changed everything, and the Soviets raced to build their own nuclear arsenal. Soviet spies infiltrated the Manhattan Project, accelerating their progress. In 1949, the USSR detonated its first atomic bomb, ending America's nuclear monopoly. A physicist at the test site recalled, "The flash was brighter than 1,000 suns. We knew the world would never be the same." The arms race shifted focus from conventional armies to nuclear weapons and delivery systems. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, emerged, ensuring that neither side would dare start a nuclear war. The Soviet military became a key player in a global standoff, where the fate of humanity rested on a balance of terror. The Red Army was no longer just a defender of borders, it was now a guardian of the world's most dangerous weapons. The Cold War would be fought in shadows, with the threat of annihilation ever present. The Soviet military's mission had changed forever. The world now lived under the shadow of the bomb. The Soviet Union's power and its peril had reached a new level. The stakes had never been higher. With Europe divided, the Soviet Union created the Warsaw Pact in 1955, binding Eastern Bloc nations under Moscow's military control. On paper, it was a collective defense alliance. In reality, it was an extension of the Red Army. Soviet doctrine, equipment, and command dominated every member state. The pact's real purpose was to create a buffer zone and keep potential conflict far from Soviet soil. A former East German officer recalled, "We were called allies, but we knew who was in charge. Our job was to be the front line." The army's role was not just to defend against NATO, but to keep its own citizens in line. When Hungary and Czechoslovakia tried to break free, Soviet tanks crushed dissent, sending a clear message. Moscow tolerated no deviation. The Warsaw Pact was a cage, not a partnership. The alliance was designed to protect the Soviet Empire and to police it. The Red Army's grip on Eastern Europe was absolute. Any challenge to Soviet authority was met with overwhelming force. The Warsaw Pact kept the empire together, by force if necessary. The cost of defiance was clear to all. The Cold War was also a race for technological supremacy. In 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, stunning the world and proving their rocket technology could reach the US. The space race was driven by military needs. Rockets for satellites were also missiles for warheads. The Soviet military-industrial complex poured resources into submarines, air defenses, and advanced jets and tanks. An engineer recalled, "We competed with the Americans and with each other. National defense was everything." This focus on military technology came at a huge cost to civilian life. The best minds and materials went to defense, leaving shortages in everyday goods. The USSR could send a man to space, but struggled to provide basic comforts at home. The Soviet military's technological achievements were world-class, but the imbalance weakened society. The seeds of decline were sown even at the height of Soviet power. The Red Army's might came at a price the nation would struggle to pay. The pursuit of military greatness shaped and strained every aspect of Soviet life. The legacy of this era would haunt the Soviet Union for decades. The cost of power was becoming clear. In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the edge of nuclear war. Soviet missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the US, triggered a tense standoff with President Kennedy. For 13 days, the world held its breath as superpowers faced off. A Soviet submarine officer recalled, "We were ready to die, and to take them with us. We didn't know if there was a world left to surface to." Negotiations and back-channel deals averted disaster. Soviets withdrew missiles from Cuba. Americans secretly removed theirs from Turkey. The crisis exposed Soviet naval weakness and fueled a massive military buildup. The world stepped back from the abyss, but the arms race accelerated. The lesson was clear. Never again would the Soviets allow themselves to be so vulnerable. The Red Army and Navy expanded, determined to match American power. The threat of nuclear war became a permanent reality. The Cuban Missile Crisis changed the Cold War forever. The balance of terror was now the foundation of global security. The Soviet military's resolve and its fears would shape the decades to come. The world had survived, but the danger had only grown. The brinkmanship of 1962 would echo for generations. By the late 1970s, the Soviet military seemed invincible until Afghanistan. In 1979, the Red Army invaded, expecting a quick victory. Instead, they faced a decade-long guerrilla war. The Mujahideen, armed by the US and others, turned Afghanistan into a quagmire. A conscript wrote home, "We control the roads by day, but the night belongs to them. We are not liberators, we are occupiers." The war drained the treasury, demoralized the army, and eroded public trust. Coffins returned in secret, but the truth spread. The Soviet military was bleeding. The war exposed the limits of Soviet power technology, and numbers could not defeat determined insurgents. By 1989, the Red Army withdrew in defeat, leaving behind thousands of dead and a sense of crisis. Afghanistan became the Soviet Union's bleeding wound. The myth of invincibility was shattered. The war's cost, human and financial, helped push the Soviet system toward collapse. The Red Army's defeat in Afghanistan marked the beginning of the end. The empire was crumbling from within. The Soviet military's greatest challenge came not from the West, but from a war it could not win. The Brezhnev era brought military parades and global power projection, but beneath the surface, the Soviet system was stagnating. The arms race with the US strained the economy. Most of the army suffered from poor equipment, corruption, and low morale. Conscripts endured brutal hazing, inadequate supplies, and a culture of survival rather than pride. Anatoly, a former tank driver, recalled, "We spent more time fixing old tanks than training. The officers stole fuel. We just wanted to go home." The military's problems mirrored those of Soviet society, rigid, corrupt, and resistant to change. The ideology that once inspired millions had become empty slogans. The war in Afghanistan, Western technological advances, and internal decay created a perfect storm. The Soviet military machine was rusting from the inside out. The weight of empire was becoming too heavy to bear. The Red Army, once a source of pride, was now a symbol of decline. The cracks in the system were widening. The Soviet Union's foundations were crumbling. The end was drawing near. Gorbachev's reforms, glasnost and perestroika, brought openness and restructuring, but also crisis. Arms control treaties, troop reductions, and the withdrawal from Afghanistan shook the military's pride and purpose. The loss of Eastern Europe and the collapse of the Warsaw Pact were devastating blows. A general lamented, "We were a superpower. Overnight, we became beggars. The politicians destroyed our army and our country." Hardliners tried to reverse course with a failed coup in 1991, but the military refused to fire on its own people. The coup's collapse fatally wounded the Soviet Union. One by one, the republics declared independence. On Christmas Day 1991, the red flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. The Soviet Union and its mighty military ceased to exist. The empire built on military power had fallen without a shot fired in its defense. The Red Army's legacy was now history. The world had changed forever. The collapse was sudden, but the decay had been long in the making. The Soviet military's end was the end of an era. The Soviet military's collapse left chaos, but its legacy endures. Russia inherited the largest share, including the nuclear arsenal, but the 1990s brought humiliation and decay. Yet the doctrines, strategies, and hardware of the Soviet era still shaped the modern Russian army. In the 2000s, Russia began to modernize, seeking to reclaim its status as a military power. The old imperatives, buffer zones, suspicion of NATO, reliance on nuclear deterrence, remain. For millions, service in the Red Army shaped identity and pride. A veteran reflected, "We held the fate of the world in our hands. We believed we were keeping the peace. I am proud of what we did." The story of the Soviet military is one of ambition, sacrifice, and ultimate failure. It shows that military might alone cannot sustain a nation if its foundations are weak. The innovations in warfare and technology still influence armies worldwide. The ghost of the Red Army haunts the geopolitical landscape. The Soviet military's rise and fall is a lesson in the power and peril of the sword. Its legacy is a warning and a reminder. The story of the Red Army is not just history. It is a shadow that still shapes our world.